Yeah, you can go if you want.
Okay.
You want to say hi to him? I think you have to stand up, because he was saying hi to people. Where's the camera? So you guys know the camera.
The camera is in the computer, so he can see it.
Say hi to him.
We're not all the same.
I have no idea.
Hello, Roland.
Good morning.
Now, I understand you're broadcasting from, zooming from Winnipeg, is that right?
Wilsonville, Oregon.
Oh, Oregon, okay. But you're from the University of Winnipeg? Oh, no.
That was a trick
I've got this reversed. Okay, so Ronan Rooney, Wrangel History Unlocked, is in Oregon right now and will be presenting history of Wrangel. Take it away, Ronan.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. I'm honored that you're here. This is a really exciting opportunity for me to present to all of you about the Bombardment of Wrangell, an event which occurred in Wrangell in 1869. I have pursued this interest in researching this topic starting around the time COVID shut down. Affected all of us at the beginning of 2020. I felt very alone and lonesome, and I wasn't going to see people, and I felt like I'm going to have all this time at home. What's something I can do? And historical research has absolutely opened doors to meeting wonderful new people, getting reacquainted with people that I have known my whole life. So this is really a joy for me to get to present this topic to all of you. If there are any issues as we're going with audio or video, please let our moderator know. Here's a quotation from today's piece that I'll explain what it means when we get there, but it really affected me when I first read it. I will be transported to the other side, and you'll get to see what that means in the context of the bombardment story. My goal today is to walk you through the story of the Bombardment of Wrangell from 1869 so that you know the key events and you can place them in Wrangell, places you can actually go today. So as I talk about events in the story, I'll tell you how you can get there and you can go look for yourself. I should give a thorough introduction of who I really am. So I did grow up in Wrangell. I was born in 1985. I graduated in 2003 from Wrangell High School. I do live in Oregon now. The part of the country that I live in is Khaachxhan land, if you're familiar with that tribe. They're around where I live here. I started a podcast called Wrangel History Unlocked in 2020. There have been many wonderful researchers on Alaska history and Wrangell history, and they've published incredible books and journals, and I thought, it's all been done. What can I do that maybe hasn't been done? And so a podcast. So you can listen to me walk through different historical events while you're working or you're exercising or something like that, if that's of interest to you. The bombardment story. The only narrative that we had for decades of what happened in the bombardment of 1869 came from U.S. Army reports that were written contemporaneously, that were written in 1869. So if you go through some of the older histories like Clarence Andrews or Hubert Hal Bancroft, people who wrote sort of tomes of Alaska history, the information that they're using comes from the Army reports. But in 1940, we got a major update to the bombardment story. 1940, as some of you probably already know, is the year of the dedication of the Chief Shakes Clan House. This is the year after years of work by the Civilian Conservation Corps and local Tlingit carvers that Wrangell gets its new Shakes Island. And so to commemorate that event, the Wrangell Sentinel sought out William Tamery to tell a story from his youth. When he was a 6-year-old boy, the U.S. Army bombed his home village. So we have this story from the Wrangell Sentinel in 1940. And then 10 years later, Tamery recorded a tape recording of him telling the story in Tlingit. So suddenly we now are confronted with two narratives that sometimes intersect and overlap, that sometimes diverge dramatically and tell two different stories. The biggest update that we have to the bombardment story came in 2012, and this is a big undertaking. This is a report authored by Dr. Zachary Jones, who has addressed this conference in the past. And it is supported by different organizations. The National Park Service Battlefield Preservation Program, is sort of pays for the lion's share of the work, but they receive support from Alaska Heritage Institute, as well as Wrangell Cooperative Association and the City of Wrangell. To translate the Tlingit, Dr. Jones relied on David Khaachxhan and Ishmael Hope, also two gentlemen who have also addressed the conference in the past as well. And this report is really the foundation to use going forward for anyone who's going to talk about the bombardment of Wrangell. It contains the official government report, as well as Tamery's 1940 Sentinel story, as well as translations of Tamery's 1950 story from Tlingit into English, as well as a wonderful ethnological by Dr. Jones. He's an anthropologist. He really understands those issues very well. I'll say what I do a little differently is I'm much more just the historian. I'm more about the concrete facts, the timeline. Dr. Jones really does a wonderful job explaining some of the deeper cultural issues, some of the importance of the sacred meaning of things and the balance. So I absolutely encourage anyone, if you're watching this on YouTube now, just pause this and go read Dr. Jones' report. It's just terrific. And then come back and listen to me. So I, in 2020, did a podcast about the bombardment. I called it the Christmas bombardment because it happens at Christmas. It's 2 one-hour episodes. I think my chief contribution to what we know about the story is biographies of the Army officers involved. I found it very illuminating, as well as I did a lot of research to find any newspaper accounts that would have been published at the time that were contemporaneous, that could confirm the Army's version of events or confirm Tamery's version of events. And to even visualize that, this is effectively what I made back in late 2020. I took everybody's versions of the stories. I took the newspaper's versions, I took the officers' versions, the 2 Tamery versions, and I just lined them up and I went down the list and I just broke off. He says this, these 2 conflict, these 2 make the same point. It's too much for me to go through in the time that we have available to us. But this is generally what I did to compare the narratives, as if I had different people telling me a story and I just wanted to compare the points against each other. So that's sort of the foundation for how I was able to piece together the story. There's other pieces of information that I used to provide context for understanding the bombardment story, to understand what was Wrangell like in 1869. So we have some old maps. We have a map made by the Russians around the 1840s. We have a map made by the United States government in 1869, the same year as the bombardment. We have a map from the 1870s after the bombardment, when Wrangell is thoroughly a frontier gold rush town and there's lots of development and there's wharfs over the water. And then we have from 1914, the Sanborn Fire Insurance Company, who came all over actually different communities in Alaska and did highly detailed maps of different communities. I mean, down to the foot. You can lay the Sanborn fire map on top of a satellite photo today and it will match up because they really did a great job. So these maps are instructive because I can use the past to sort of get an idea of what the landscape looked like, and then I can use Sanborn as in essence to say, okay, here's exactly where the fort is because it corresponds to where buildings are in 1914. So an easier way of looking at these maps. This is the Russian map. I just added some color. Maybe this helps you visualize it. In the 1840s, this is all Tlingit country. The footprint of Russia is very small at this point. You can see perhaps there's this sort of, here's in my research, I call it the fingers. I don't know if there was a traditional name for this piece of land, but it sort of sticks out kind of like a hand, and there's just little bits of land jutting off, and that's where the Russians built their fort, Redoubt St. Dionysius. If you're interested in going to that location today, it's the location of the Marine Bar. You can't miss it. It's right on the way to Shakes Island. So there's this sort of little peninsula, there's this Russian fort, and the Tlingit village moves from the south end of Wrangel Island, Khaachxhan, and comes up north here, and is all around the Russian fort. And the Russian fort is not in a great position anyway, because it's kind of low to the ground. George Simpson, who's the head of the Hudson's Bay Company, comes in the 1840s, and he sees this, and he's not complimentary. He does not think this is a good location. He observes that at the high tide, water can come in underneath the walls of the fort. So the location of Redoubt St. Dionysius, not good, not great. And when the British occupy it, they call it Fort Khaachxhan, but that only lasts about a decade. No one's crazy about this fort, and it falls into disrepair. So decades later, we have a US Army map from 1869, and you can see there's some similarities between what the cartographer drew for the Russians in 1840s, and then some similarities in 1869, but they're different. This is what I have learned about the challenge of map makers in Southeast Alaska. Our coastline is very rugged, and we have two dramatic tides a day that dramatically can change the shape of the coastline. So there are some differences here. But what's interesting about this one is that this is very close to around the time of the bombardment. So you see what I call the fingers, that little peninsula that comes out. You can see there's Shakes Island off on the end, kind of in the center of what's labeled as Edelin Harbor. By the time you get to the 1870s, we've covered that little peninsula, the fingers, we've covered that up with this sawmill dock. Today, even in Wrangell, we'll talk about the old mill dock, and we're not kidding, because it really is that old. This is one of the first things to really dramatically change the physical landscape of Wrangell, is the arrival of this dock that just built right on top of it. And that was the site of so many homes in the village, and so it becomes a mill dock. So that changes the landscape as well. And then if we get here to 1914, you see that mill dock has just expanded. There are homes on Shakes Island. I mean, the Sanborn fire map is a much smaller area of survey, but it's much, much more detailed. If you're interested in seeing a more highly detailed version of this, I can help you out. This is actually 3 images, and so I photoshopped them together, and I gave it some color, so your eye might, be able to tell things apart. But lots of dramatic change right on the coastline. So another instructive map that we have is from the 1880s by George Thornton Emmons, who comes to the village, and he is not much of a cartographer. I think it probably took him 2 seconds to draw the coastline, but he gives us a name of the different clans and where the homes are approximated. And this is very instructive. This is very helpful for those of us who look at the bombardment story and want to know where the different families are who are affected, who are mentioned in the story. So getting to know this is helpful too. So we also have maps of Fort Wrangel itself. Here are 2 I was able to find. These are from the US government. Fort Wrangel is not very large. It's only on about an acre of land. It's about 200 by 200 feet. And it's at the site of the post office today. Here is a more detailed reconstruction of the Fort Wrangel map. I've gone ahead and labeled the buildings. So, north is up, south is down. So in this fort along the water, the sort of front facing of the fort is not the coast. It's literally south. It's literally the village. This is a time, 1868, when U.S. Army arrives to begin construction of this fort, where there's very few white people. There's very few European settlers. It's a thriving Tlingit village along the harbor. And so this fort is effectively built facing them. It's sort of a foreshadowing that you've got a big blockhouse that's just on a hill overlooking this village. You go to Wrangell today and you walk around downtown or you go out to Shakes Island, you can't really see the post office. There's lots of two-story buildings all over Wrangell today that obscure that view. But in 1868, without those buildings there, you would have really had a good vantage of that fort anywhere you are along the coast because it's up on a hill. There's not stuff in between. So at one point, Fort Wrangell was somewhat visually prominent. You would have seen it. It would have been also a place in the fort to have an eye on everything going on around. Okay. Another way of studying Old Wrangell, and this is my favorite, and this one is my favorite because I still get to do this today on Instagram and on Facebook. It's pictures of Wrangell from Mount Dewey. This is a really exceptional thing about the community of Wrangell, is to have a bird's eye view of the community taken from roughly the same place for over 100 years. And that is just Mount Dewey right here. So you can just line up the photos. You can watch the change over time as docks come in, as the mill dock expands, as Phil changes things, seasons change. It is just a beautiful view in the first place, and it is quite illuminating for those of us who love to study the changes in Wrangell. So if you're visiting Wrangell, I absolutely encourage you to go check out the view from Mount Dewey. To get there, the easiest way I would describe it is go behind the Presbyterian Church, go up that street, and once you see 3rd Avenue, hook a left and go along 3rd, and there's the trailhead there. It is a well-marked trail. It is somewhat steep at some points. It's a lot of boardwalk, but you are going up a hill. I think you could probably do it in 20, 30 minutes. So consider that. It's a wonderful place to see a sunset or really any time of day. If you're familiar with John Muir building a fire on top of the mountain in Wrangell in 1879 that he published in his book, that happened September 15, 1879. So 1 week from today. So think about that while you're up there. Okay. So that's what I can use to sort of help me understand what Wrangell was like in the past. This is the introduction to the man who is most responsible for the bombardment of Wrangell. His name is William Borrowe, and he's the commander of Fort Wrangell at the time of the bombardment. I didn't know what I was going to find when I started looking into him. And everything I found kind of shocked me and explained so much about what came later. So we'll go back in time a little further. Antietam, 1862. This is the single bloodiest day of the U.S. Civil War. More people die here than any other battle. And William Borrowe is there. He is an infantry officer. He joined the Union Army when Lincoln asked for volunteers. Before he was in the Army, he had been a stockbroker in New York City. And there are so many Civil War histories and Civil War accounts. He's not a major player, but he is mentioned, and he's often commended by his superiors for his fearlessness in battle, his ability to organize men around cannons, getting them to engage in the battle, even when it's very heated and very dangerous. So he has marks of distinction leading men in infantry in battle. But in 1864, shortly before the Civil War is over, he is charged with forgery and reporting false muster, court-martial offenses. And so he is court-martialed out of the U.S. Army. He's out. He writes to Abraham Lincoln, who's president, and he begs to be let back into the service. And Abraham Lincoln, in his notes to his subordinates, makes a note saying, "I decline to make any further order in this case." So Abraham Lincoln is done with William Borrowe. William Borrowe is out of the military. And then the Civil War ends. And then, as we all know, Abraham Lincoln is assassinated. So following the assassination of Lincoln, Vice President Andrew Johnson becomes president, and he restores William Borrowe to service and sends him out west. So a man who has already been court-martialed out of service for forgery and false muster, for lying, is now back in, and he's given his rank and his command, and he's sent out west. He's sent out west to, this is not far from where I am in Oregon. This is the Owyhee River. And here, William Borrowe becomes acquainted with this man, Dr. William McKay. I'm holding up a journal right now. This is the Oregon Historical Quarterly from the summer of 1978. This was the darkest thing I came across in researching the Bombardment of Wrangell. This was darker than the story of the bombardment, I felt. So here's what happens. William Borrowe arrives in Oregon Territory, and there are, at this point, many white European settlers coming to establish farms and communities out in Oregon, often on land that is still occupied by indigenous people. Treaties have guaranteed them the right to continue to occupy that land, and yet here come the settlers. And so what William Borrowe does is he makes Dr. William McKay a lieutenant, and Dr. McKay enlists men of some of the neighboring tribes. He recruits them at the fort to effectively go and hunt down men, women, and children of the different tribes with which they're at war. So that's Northern Paiute, Bannock, and Western Shoshone. And it's quite gruesome. I'm not going to go into it. In my podcast, I barely could talk about it, but it's in here. Dr. McKay, in the winter, keeps a daily diary of traveling around and collecting scalps of men, women, and children. It's in here, it's like he's writing receipts, and it's just so cold. But Borrowe is commended. Borrowe is seen as an effective leader, delivering results. He is then sent on to the San Juan Islands, which is just north of the Owyhee River in Oregon. This is up in Puget Sound area, Salish Sea. So now he's here at the fort, and he's got his wife and he's got his kids, and he is a lieutenant, and he is acquainted with the major who's in charge of all of this. But the major's wife, Mary Julia Tyson Allen, writes a letter to her sister, which a museum now has. And I will read a brief snip from you. Red flags. She's just writing to her sister. This guy is red flags. She says, "I am afraid if I say anything about them, I shall say too much. However, whatever I do say, remember, is to be repeated to no one. Some of the older officers of the regiment came to the major and told him there were some officers on board that he would not want to know or have me know their wives. One of them was Lieutenant Borrowe's wife. He was dismissed from the army once, but was reappointed, and I heard an officer say the other day they would subscribe to the regiment $1,000 to present him if he would resign. He is a most elegant lieutenant, and if you were in his presence 5 minutes and did not know the man, he would make you believe black was white. But enough of him. But remember, do not hint a word of this, for really I should not like to get his ill will. I do not suppose I shall ever meet them again, as Harvey never asks him in when he comes to the door on business." She's just writing to her sister. I mean, she's volunteering these informations about this guy who gives her the creeps, and she doesn't want to know him, and her husband doesn't want to know him, and yet they're kind of stuck with him because they are all in the service. I couldn't believe I was reading this. That she would just take the time in this letter to her sister to mention all these things about this guy that she just was creeped out by. Okay, William Borrowe. Now, around this time, Russia and the United States negotiate the Treaty of Cession, where Russia sells its interests in Alaska to the United States. And that leads to Borrowe coming up to Fort Wrangel. So this is a photo of Fort Wrangel, 1868. It is still very early on. Treaty of Cession is signed the year before. It's not until 1868 that the Army sends anyone to to Wrangel Island. And it's during this time that they're still putting up the fence, they're putting up some of the buildings. We have from the post returns that many Tlingit men were hired on a daily salary and ration to do the construction work on the fort. This photo that you're looking at right here, though, this is taken by a man named Edward Muybridge. Edward Muybridge shot a lot of stereoscopic photos. Stereoscope, so stereo means two, you know, so stereoscopic photos. Just like your eye, you've got one eye and another eye, and they look at an image and they put it together, and then you have depth perception. That's what a stereoscopic image does. I take two photos that are a little bit set away from each other, and then using a special visual, looks kind of like this, it puts it together and you get one image that really feels 3D, and it's super cool. I've done this, it's really fun. I can't demonstrate that through Zoom, but what I can do is show you each image back and forth real quick. I'll do it briefly. If you are the type that gets motion sickness, just look away for a second. I'll just show it for a few seconds, but by looking at these images, one then the other, you can sort of imagine that you're looking at a small bit of film. And in fact, Edward Muybridge is considered by some the inventor of motion pictures, because he does stuff like this. And then he figures out how to make it even better and better and better until he's created motion pictures. So you get seasick, look away, but I'll just show you a few seconds worth of this. So here's some men sitting in front of the fort, and they're sitting on the rocks at what is clearly low tide. Here's a small group of people sitting out near Shoestack's Point with the fort in the background. And then here's a group of men sitting in front of Khaachxhan totems in the background there. And so it really does feel like you're watching a movie, in that the background changes and it looks like they're a little bit alive. That's what Muybridge's big contribution is to engineering and science, is that he invents a way for motion pictures to be captured. And he came to Wrangell in 1868 and took some amazing photos. Okay, so also in Wrangell at this time, who's come up with William Borrowe and all the enlisted men who had been down in the San Juan Islands. This is William Borrowe's second in command. This is Melville Loucks. Melville Loucks is pretty young at this point. He's in his late 20s. He spent the Civil War enrolled at West Point. He did not see combat duty. He was literally in school during the Civil War. So he gets out of school in 1864. He is number 22 in his class of 27. And he is sent out west as well. And that's where he becomes acquainted with William Borrowe. So I don't have a photo of William Borrowe. I just have that sketch that's sort of nondescript. Here I actually have a photo of Melville Loucks. And I did a little restoration. Here's what he looks like. I don't know a whole lot about him, but I do know this, and this was a really cool piece to connect to the story. I'm very proud of just finding this through Googling. Melville Loucks acquired two pieces of Tlingit artwork. He acquired this pipe that you see on the left, and he acquired this rattle that you see on the right. I'll show you another angle of each of these items. How we know that Melville Loucks acquired these pieces of property is because he carved his name into the rattle. He carved into it, made by the Alaska Indians, brought by M.R. Loucks, first lieutenant officer. So I'll just kind of show you this two sides of this. So what's he doing with this stuff? Why does he need this stuff? I don't know how he came across it. Honest means dishonest means I don't necessarily know. But this is something we know about Loucks now, is that he has these sacred things. So that's Melville Loucks. All right. So shortly after arriving in Fort Wrangell in late 1868, William Borrowe and Melville Loucks move up the chain in the fact that their commanding officers in Fort Wrangell are sent elsewhere. One has a medical issue, one is reassigned to go somewhere else. And so now William Borrowe's in charge, and Melville Loucks is his right-hand man. About the same exact time that William Borrowe assumes command of the fort, it's the bombardment of Khaachxhan. And that happens in February 1869. That's just 10 months before the bombardment of Wrangell. And it's also very close to Wrangell. I don't know the bombardment of Khaachxhan story nearly as well as I know the Wrangell story. I've spent my time on the Wrangell story. But these two are so connected because they're so close. And as everyone is going through the experience of the bombardment, this has to be a fresh memory because this happened so close to where they live. And this is so awful. The USS Saginaw destroys villages. There are people who are killed, and it's just awful. So there's already a chill in the air. And this is about the time that Borrowe takes his command. And so somehow I imagine that influences the way everybody feels about each other. This is so early in the United States occupation of Tlingit land that the relationship is still being defined. It's still up for grabs. Is this going to be good or bad thing? And so this has to be a clear sign that things are going bad. So a few months later, after the bombardment of Khaachxhan, William Henry Seward comes and pays a visit to Fort Wrangel, and he goes up the Stickeen River. This is just a few years after he survives an assassin's knife to the face, which leaves him permanently scarred on his right cheek. He comes to Fort Wrangel, inspects the fort, feels very proud of himself for the Treaty of Cession, and gets to see the Stickeen River. He did not report seeing anything out of sorts. I think he was probably shown a best possible view of the operation. So shortly after Vincent Colyer visit, shortly after Seward visits, a man named Vincent Colyer comes. Vincent Colyer is a humanitarian. Vincent Colyer, during the Civil War, became part of a Christian organization to provide medical supplies, to provide couriering mail, entertainment, anything to just make the experience better. He was a witness to the Battle of Bull Run, which was exceptionally awful. And so he starts this organization to try to make life easier for these men in uniform. Colyer helps recruit a regiment of African-American formerly enslaved men to fight for the Union. And Colyer, after the war, heads out west and does illustrations, such as this illustration you see in the background of Fort Wrangell. Vincent Colyer does these illustrations wherever he goes. This is, I think, one of the powerful things about him is that picture says 1,000 words. And if he does illustrations of formerly enslaved men and women, it's quite compelling. He does illustrations of beautiful landscapes of indigenous people. And he comes to Wrangell and he does exactly that as well. So he draws the fort and everything around it. He goes off to Shakes Island and he does illustrations of that as well. And he makes sure that he captures the whole village as a view by going out kind of, maybe around the area of Khaachxhan.áak'w Point and captures that as well. So Colyer comes, does these pictures. He also does a census of the village. Vincent Colyer goes door to door and he knocks on doors and he says, "Hi, I'm Vincent Colyer. I'm here to do a census. How many men do you have here? How many women? How many boys? How many girls?" And he creates this table. He counts a total of 508 individuals living in the village at this time. 159 men, 349 women and children. This is instructive to us. We know that in the middle of the 1800s, there's awful epidemics that really decrease the population. And yet there's still quite a thriving community of 508 individuals. Another way to look at this information, and I've sort of tried to find ways that visually communicate this in ways that are sort of maybe more relatable. You could look at it like this. You could say, all right, so here's the 32 homes that Vincent Colyer identified. And here on the left are women and girls, and on the right are men and boys. some things that you might pick out about here. So there's 183 women, 159 men. There are 89 girls, 77 boys. Every house has at least one child, and there are 7 houses with 10 or more children. So the average house has 16 residents, and there are 9 homes with 20 or more people. So quite a community. He goes and knocks on doors. It's a very personal thing to do, and he really engages and wants to get to know them. If you want to look at that census, here's another way to visually represent that. You can see the men and boys in blue on the left, women and girls in red and pink on the right, and then down below is the staff of Fort Wrangel. And so there are 60 enlisted men in Fort Wrangel at the time of the bombardment and 3 officers. So at the time, it would have certainly felt like, wow, there's so many more Tlingit people here than there are this army operation. And that's true. There's so many more people. There's just lots of people living in this village at this time. So Colyer also has a bad run-in with First Lieutenant William Borrowe and First Lieutenant Lieutenant Loucks. So what happens here? What happens here is that Vincent Colyer is doing his census. He's in the village, and he comes across a badly beaten Tlingit man. And he approaches him, and he asks him, what happened to you? And he tells he's been beat. He's been beat in front of the store of Leon Smith. And it was by some army soldiers who were being, at that point, kicked out of Alaska. They've been kicked out of Sitka. They're just in Wrangell long enough to have a layover. And so they get off the boat. They beat this poor man up. And so Colyer goes to bat for the guy. Colyer approaches Borrowe and says, are you going to let this stand? And Borrowe says, oh, I have no control here over what those, I'm not in charge. And so Colyer leans on him and says, well, get Loucks to go take care of it. Loucks goes and sort of investigates and comes back and says, the guy had it coming. There's nothing I can do. So Colyer makes note of this. Also Colyer, another bad experience with William Borrowe. Colyer is there when a steamship arrives from down south, and it is just full of alcohol. It is just full of beer and whiskey and rum, brandy. And Colyer says, there's a rule against alcohol here, even though this alcohol is labeled as for the use of the officers at the fort. Colyer is not buying it. And so he leans on William Borrowe and says, what are you going to do about this? And so Borrowe has to think, or pretend to think, and says, well, we'll land the beer, but we'll send the spirits to Sitka. Fine. So again, Colyer makes note of this. That Colyer is here is interesting because there's not supposed to be anybody watching it. As far as Borrowe's concerned, he's in charge of the whole operation of everything. And here is this independent man who's a humanitarian, who's very interested in Tlingit people. And he's capturing information. And that's going to prove very important later on. So I would say too about how much alcohol he caught. He caught, I think it was 5. Yeah. Okay. So it's a quantity of porter and light wines, 10 barrels of ale, 5 barrels of distilled spirits. And so at that point, a barrel is 48 gallons. So it's about 240 gallons of distilled spirits that he catches coming in. So quite a bit. So that provides some context. Now let's talk about Christmas Day, 1869. So Christmas Day, 1869, there is a huge party that happens at Fort Wrangel, and the Tlingit people in the town are invited to come. And we know that there are 2 brothers named Shawan and Esteen who were invited, and each of them bring their wives. Shawan's wife is Khaachxhan, Esteen's wife is Khaachxhan, and they are invited to come to the fort for what the newspapers describe as just a day of drinking. I mean, just liquors are freely distributed. It's meant to be a big party. What's interesting about this is that none of the army reports mention that there was a party. Absolutely not in there. So for decades, people who wrote about this event said nothing about a party. It's really Tamari who gives us that light in that there's this big party here. And then if you go and check the newspapers, it backs up Tamari that there is this big party and there's lots of alcohol being served. So now, these 4 individuals, are they the 4 individuals you see to the right? I don't have that. I don't have that. I don't have that. But I've always imagined it just because there's so few photos from this time and this small group sitting out on the rocks. I just always thought in my imagination, like, I'll just cast them in the role. So I'm not saying it's them, but just for, the theater of the mind, it certainly helps to have something to imagine. So they take the invitation and they go to Fort Wrangel and they have a wonderful day-long Christmas party inside the walls of the fort. This violates some rules that the Army has, which is that you're not allowed to serve alcohol to the indigenous people, and you're not allowed to have them inside the fort as well. But William Borrowe hosts a long Christmas Day party, and he's certainly got plenty of alcohol to serve as well. After a long day, it becomes nighttime. This is Christmas evening, 1869. And here's what Tamari remembers. He remembers that the soldiers are playing violin and accordion. If you check the post returns, that's absolutely what's going on, is that there is a big there's a big party going on and they're playing music. So the fort is not very big, but this building itself is about 50 by 30. It's about 1,500 square feet. It's got a big porch in front. Other previous versions of the story, including Tamari's, say that this is happening inside the officers' quarters. That's a separate building. It's a much smaller building. One of my contributions to the bombardment story is that I place a lot here. I think this is where the party happened because it's simply the only building that's big enough to fit everyone who's described. It's got a staircase, which is going to come into the story as well. And so I think that the party is happening here inside this, what is the hospital building, big 2-story hospital building. Okay, very cool. So they do a dance. It's called a quadrille. And the thing about a quadrille is that it is kind of funny. A quadrille is very proper. It's people bowing and curtsying. Men have handkerchiefs that they throw around. To see it, it's kind of funny, but it was very popular at the time. And so they invite some of the Tlingit guests to enjoy the quadrille as well. So the captain invites Khaachxhan to dance, and Khaachxhan comes and she dances with him, and she's been down south. She's been to Victoria, and so she's familiar with this dance and she knows what to do. She goes back to Esteen. Now it's Khaachxhan's turn. Khaachxhan comes and she dances, and she doesn't know the dance. She doesn't know this at all. And people start laughing at her, and she's humiliated. And this is really where this insult, this is where everything really starts. Because then this is where Shawan, her husband, comes and intervenes. He's humiliated as well. He takes his wife and he pushes her down a staircase inside of this building. So down below in an anteroom off the staircase is a woman who has not been attending the party, but she can hear it going on. She hears Khaachxhan screaming. She hears a woman falling down the stairs. In previous versions of this story, she has been described as the post laundress. She's been described as the captain's wife. She's been described as Mrs. Jacob Muller. I'm very proud to say I did some research and I found her. Her name is Angelina Muller. She has a first name. It's Angelina. She's born in London. And here she is on the other side of the world in this fort where her husband is the quartermaster. And she gets Khaachxhan and she brings Khaachxhan into an anteroom. And it's just a really powerful part of the story for me, because what do these two women have in common? They're from other sides of the globe. They probably don't speak the same language. Maybe you've never met, but what they have in common is that they constantly live under the threat of men. And so Angelina gets her and tries to make her safe. It doesn't end well. So Khaachxhan's husband, Shawan, is very upset. He comes down the stairs. He wants his wife. He tries to push into the room. Angelina tries to push him away, and in trying to push him away, she puts her hand on his face and she pushes, And in that moment of pressure where there's two bodies against each other, Siobhan bites down on Angelina Muller's finger, middle finger on the right hand, and severs it, which would have been absolutely horrifying to behold, I'm sure. Absolutely awful. And according to Tamari, it's in this moment that Siobhan is shot and killed, and his brother Esteen is shot as well and badly injured. Though this is where the stories start to get most different between the Army version and the Tamari version. So what happens in the Army version is that Lieutenant Loucks did not shoot and kill Siobhan or Esteen in the fort. Instead, that evening, he goes into the village with 20 enlisted men to arrest Siobhan. Okay, so he goes from the fort at night, walking all the way into the village, goes to arrest Siobhan. He encounters a man named Khaachxhan, who tells him where to find Siobhan. And so Loucks and 12 men now walk inside of the house where they believe Siobhan is found, and they attempt to arrest him. And all his enlisted men line up against the wall of the house, and it's very much like a firing squad. And what ensues is effectively a firing squad in that Loucks says, I intended to stun Siobhan by hitting him on the head with a saber, as if that would stun him. And forgetting that to pull his saber was his indication to his enlisted men to begin firing. And so what happens is the enlisted men begin firing. Siobhan is shot and killed here. Esteen is badly injured. So divergent. Tamari says the shooting happens right inside the fort immediately. Loucks says, no, it happens in the village inside this house later on. This is where Khaachxhan enters the picture. Khaachxhan is the father of Siobhan and Esteen. He's described as being a medicine man. He's definitely an elder, and he's woken by his wife, who tells him that, your son's been shot. And this sets off a rift in the system of Tlingit justice. The unjustifiable killing of Siobhan, to remediate it, Khaachxhan seeks out a white man to kill. And so he goes from the village up to the fort. He sees the fort is locked. He's not able to get in there. And so he goes on to another location. This is where he goes and he finds the store of Leon Smith and William King Lear. This store is very familiar to some of you. This is the site of Norris Gift Shop, as I knew it as a kid. I'm not sure what's there now. To find this particular building, it's between J&W's and the drugstore. So you can go find that building. But that is the site of Leon Smith's store where he is at this night. Back in 1869, Leon Smith on the left had started the store with a man named William King Lear on the right. At this particular point in the evening, Lear is not there. It's just Leon Smith out in front of his store. Khaachxhan sees him and pulls his trigger and shoots him with a hunting shot. Leon Smith is shot 14 times in the torso, 3 times in the left wrist. He barely survives. He will last another 18 hours. So Leon Smith is brought back to the fort, and it's just a full-on panic. It's terrifying. And so at this point, we've got a message from the officers of the fort for the village, which is sent by an anonymous Tlingit woman. And the Tlingit woman comes in the dead of night to the fort, and William Borrowe says, I told her to tell the chiefs of the village that if they don't give me the man that shot Smith, I will bomb them at noon. Well, this message doesn't go anywhere. This is Borrowe's first failed attempt at delivering this message. Let's see. So Loucks goes into the village in the morning, and he is surrounded by men in the village. It's Loucks with a translator named William Wall and 20 enlisted men surrounded by 80 Tlingit men. That's estimated to be every able-bodied man in the village. And it's absolutely getting nowhere. They're not talking to him. They're not interested in this. So the second time this message failed to deliver. Third time the message failed to deliver is where the officers of the fort figure out, well, there is that guy named Khaachxhan.áak'w who can speak English and Tlingit. Let's get him and he'll go to Shakes Island and tell them our demands. 3 times Khaachxhan.áak'w goes between the fort and Shakes Island, getting nowhere. And so at 2 p.m., the firing begins. And at this point, to the demonstration of how the 6-pound cannon looks. At this point, it goes on for hours. The range of the 6-pounder cannon, here, I'll show it to you like this. This is generally where they'd be able to reach. And so the villagers begin evacuating women and children to the south to get out of the range of the 6-pounder guns. Also, some of the village go up on Mount Dewey and begin firing upon the fort. So I'm fast forwarding you to a photo from 1922. This is a vantage of the fort from Mount Dewey, and you can see quite clearly, you can look right down in there. If there was walls around there, you could look inside the walls. You would have the high ground for any kind of attack. The fort responds to this by using scatter shot. It's cannon that basically sprays shrapnel in sort of a general area. It's what you do when you have an enemy that you can't see exactly where they are, so you just kind of fill the air. And this is effective. It dislodges the Tlingit contingent from the hill overlooking the fort, and that is sort of the end of that. So it's the evening of December 26th. After a long day of cannon fire, the cannons are quiet. Chief Shakes teams up with Tawiat, who is a fellow elder, and they make a plan to go to the fort and have a negotiation. They want to sit down with William Borrowe and they want to discuss terms, not of surrender. It's been a full day of cannon fire. What they discuss is Chief Shakes wants the man that killed Shawan. If he gets that, he'll be happy and he'll give SOK over. That could have been it. And so William Borrowe genuinely considers it. He genuinely considers giving the man who killed Shawan over to Chief Shakes. Doesn't happen, but leaves it open. So there was a negotiation. The army never writes about this, but a newspaper does confirm that this happened. So it's been a long night. Chief Shakes is impatiently waiting for anything back from the army. He's not getting any word back any which way. And so he goes to Tawiat and he says, let's go fight him. Let's go get him. And Tawiat says, we can't do that. We're just a little dog. They're a big dog. At the same time, too, there is some, apparently reported by the army, some fire that they received from musketry. And so they respond by shooting again, starting the cannons back up. And this time they shoot at Shakes Island with another weapon from the 12-pound howitzer. This is exploding shell. So this stuff is designed to work like a bomb that flies. It lands at a target and explodes just about the same time, sends up a great deal of shrapnel. And you can see, if you look at the range of something like this, so there was the range of the 6-pounder gun. You look at the range of the 12-pounder, it's much shorter. So really, Shakes Island is just at the edge of where that gun can penetrate. At this point, delegation of chiefs from the Tlingit village come and they discuss terms of surrender. And this is, to quote William Borrowe, this is a hostage moment here. What he does is he says, until you give me SOK, I want you to give me SOK's mother and one of the sub-chiefs from the tribe. So he uses the word hostages. So this is where William Borrowe takes the hostages and awaits SOK's return. There are no more shots fired in this battle. If you are taking count, that was 15 solid shot cannonballs, 4 canisters, 4 shells, and 110 ball cartridge. So no more shots fired, but this is so far what's just taken 2 days to deploy from the fort. So SOK makes a farewell journey through the village. He goes from where he's been hiding in the woods for 2 days without food, and he walks out to Shoestack's Point, and he sees the destruction on the way. In Wrangell, we have a concept now of out the road. It's the Zimovia Highway, but you can go out the road, and that's the furthest you can go out. Here in 1869, think of this that way. There's this village, and Skutdu is at the end of the village. You know, he's just right there at on the point. And so this is Skutdu's farewell. It's sad, you know. He has a final meal. He says goodbye. Everyone feels terribly for him, but they know that for this bombing to stop, that he has to surrender himself. And this is where Skutdu says something that I think is so powerful. He says, "I will be transported to the other side." And what does that mean? When I read that, I knew that had many meanings. So he could be at Shustak's house. He could be talking about, I need to go from your point across the water to the fort. He could also be talking about, I need to go from the Tlingit side to the army side. And then most poetically, perhaps with some self-awareness here, is that he's going from life to death, because he knows this will be the end of him. He will not just be going to the other side in terms of going from a peninsula across the water to land. This will be the end of him. He will be going to the other side. So he does this journey, and he arrives at the fort. He's put in the guardhouse, and William Borrowe orders a court-martial of a man who is a civilian, who is just not in the military, but it's a court-martial. That's the doctor off to the left, who I don't have a picture of. But these are the judges and jurors of the court-martial. You've got Dr. Kirk, you've got William Borrowe, Melville Loucks, and the business partner of the late Leon Smith, King Lear. So they sentence Skutdu to hanging. And it is the very first execution in Alaska under the United States. I don't have the exact location where it happened. I wish I did. I don't know if it's in the fort or just outside the fort, but that's a big momentous event. So what about the bombardment? Why does it stand out? This is a calendar showing 1869, all the days where the US military engaged in some action against Native American people. There's a lot of red X's on this. How does the bombardment even fit in? How do you even notice that it's happening here? Well, it matters for all of us who love to study this place and this time, because it just fits the pattern so much. But one thing that breaks from the pattern, Vincent Colyer publishes this right here. It's blurred out. That's so funny. But you can see it on the screen. This is from Harper's Magazine, February 1870. It shows his illustrations of the village. And the public is like, this is beautiful. This is great. What is this bombing that we just heard happen here? And so Congress asks Colyer to publish a report, which he does in April 1870, where he throws the book at the commanders of Fort Wrangel and says, you have been debauching these people with alcohol. You're responsible for this. In fact, I've got letters from lots of other people, including people like William Duncan down in Metlakatla, who say, you're the worst thing in Alaska right now. Get the army out of here. And so that's exactly what the army does. They effectively dismissed both of these men. Melville Loucks, that was his last Christmas in uniform, because he's dismissed from military service in December 1870. And then he dies just 2 years later. William Borrowe is dismissed from military service at the beginning of 1871. He goes on to be charged with embezzlement. He goes on to be accused of fraudulently selling insurance. And then my favorite headline from the whole piece, Borrowe's borrow ends in sorrow, charged with obtaining money under false pretenses. He's absolutely a crook. He's a lifetime crook. You know, it wasn't just the forgery and false muster that Lincoln couldn't stand. It's what happens at bombardment. And then his life afterwards is just a litany of this kind of stuff. Chief Shakes V survives Melville Loucks and is buried in a very nice grave on the hill over Case Avenue, which you can find just behind the boat shop. John Muir comes to Wrangell in 1879 and says that a good thrashing, prompt, heavy, wholesale, and whole-souled, discriminating only as to the offending tribes, not as to individuals. Such a punishment will last on the average about one generation and is ever found to be productive of the best results. This is deep. I mean, this is a deep cultural belief, and John Muir is espousing it in Wrangell in 1879. The bombardment of Angoon happens in 1881 by the USS Corwin. Khaachxhan, who many of you know, in 1899 remembers Leon Smith as the man who came to Wrangell and said that it was time to be part of America, that Americans had purchased it. So there was some memory of this man, even though he was in Wrangell only like a year and a half. Shoestack's point has changed. Where Shoestack's house was is now big oil drums. You can see them if you walk out to the point right there. Two people who survived the bombardment, Tilly Paul Tamery and Charlie Jones, went on to become very influential people. If I give a shout out right here, the anniversary of their famous vote is coming up on November 7, 2022. If you're in Wrangell, you want to see where that vote happened, you can. It's this building right here. It's on the corner of Church and McKinnon Street. So you can go check that out. The fort became the post office. And recently I found a version of the bombardment story in a book as told by Thomas Ukas. So this is now new and exciting for us to study. I think I'm at time now, so I just kind of like want to wrap it up. But I so thoroughly appreciate you all coming here. I'm honored to say that the United States Army has taken a new look at this and is being more apologetic about this than they ever were in the past. This report for the AFN is really eye-opening, and Dr. Rosita Worrell contributed to this. I absolutely recommend checking that out to see where things are today. I hope to see you all at Christmas sometime. We can discuss this further, but until then, thank you all so much. This is a huge honor, and I really appreciate it.